Hello everyone, welcome back to the True North Report. I'm your friendly neighborhood knucklehead, and this is the news you need to know about. So I found that video of the deer going around the play structure there a few days ago, and I thought it was pretty entertaining, so I thought I'd just play a quick clip for it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet today. So we got a few different stories that we're going to be talking about today. The first one has to do about the amount of violence that pro-life women have been facing over the last little bit. There's been at least 2 incidents that have taken place over the last week or so, and it has to do with women who consider themselves pro-life and against abortions that have found themselves at the receiving end of violence. And if I'm remembering correctly, in both cases, it has to do at the hands of men, which makes it a little ironic because a lot of the people who consider themselves pro-choice consider themselves pro-women. They consider themselves, like many of them would consider themselves male feminists, yet they have no problem attacking women who have who disagree with their point of view. We're also going to see the return of Canada's favorite villain, which you will know who I'm talking about when once we get to her. And then we're going to be discussing a little bit about how not so much the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh at the U.S. Supreme Court, but a little more about the protests that took place around that and how that actually affects public opinion and public perception. We're going to be talking a little bit more about immigration, simply because there was a number of at least one, actually, I should say. I shouldn't try and say too many. But there was an asylum seeker who ended up receiving a voter registration card from Elections Canada. So many people see this as a huge breach in the system, and many have concerns with Trudeau's new law that he's putting in place for voter protection. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about ISIS, because there's some more development there when it comes to Canada. I'm sure many of you know what I'm going to be talking about. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the Toronto Star has accused Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, of murdering the worker class. That just sounds very Marxism right there, and it is quite Marxist, so we're going to get into that somewhere near the end. So to start off today, we're going to be talking about a man called Jordan Hunt. Jordan Hunt was doing a pro-choice protest when a woman came up and started filming him, and after a brief exchange between the two, he ends up roundhouse kicking her. And we have the video right here. I'm sure many people have seen it because it went viral online. And since then, Jordan Hunt has been arrested and has been charged with a number of different assault charges.
It's hard to confuse everybody.
But still, it's better to be, you want to kill him with kindness, remember?
That's right. What?
They actually have people filming you the whole time. Which
Cool.
is why I say kill with kindness.
Guess what? Hey.
Destruction of private property. It's against the law.
Somebody gets raped by somebody and they're like, I'm a 16-year-old and I can't have this baby. Think you should keep it?
It's a baby.
Yeah.
If someone was raped and she gave birth and she decided to kill her 3-year-old child.
I meant to get your phone.
Someone call the cops.
Meant to get your phone.
Do not touch me. Someone call the cops.
I meant to
I'm
So that was a video right there, and it is quite a disturbing video because, well, he did say at the end, Jordan Hunt, that he meant to kick her phone. We don't know if that's actually true, because could be very likely that he meant to kick her and was trying to use the excuse that he was trying to kick her phone as a way to downplay what he has done. But either way, it is an unacceptable act. I mean, he assaulted her by doing that, and he probably hurt her by roundhouse kicking her like that. But even if he had just hit her phone, even if he had not managed to, if he had done what he was saying he was trying to do, the problem with this is the fact that he would still be destroying her private property, something that he had been doing throughout the day, because as more reports were coming out against his actions, it turns out that this was not the first person that he had been Well, he didn't hit anyone else, but he had been doing destroying private property throughout the day. There was certain situations where he was going around and writing on people's clothing, and one of them even was, I believe it was a 10-year-old girl that he ended up doing this to. But this is simply because they had a different point of view. And the thing is that when it comes to the pro-choice movement, a number of the people who are pro-choice consider themselves pro-woman. They consider themselves, a number of them anyway, consider themselves male feminists, if we're talking from the male perspective. So they believe themselves to be pro-woman. They believe themselves to be male feminists, but people like Jordan Hunt have no problem at assaulting a woman who has a different point of view than his own. And the examples that are given a lot of times to me are just bad examples. I mean, he says something like a 16-year-old girl who ends up getting raped and then she doesn't want to keep the baby. This is a situation that goes down from time to time. There's no denying that. But when we look at who gets an abortion and for what reasons, there is data out there. Most people do not get an abortion for this reason. In fact, most people, it's quite the opposite. They get it because they believe that the baby is an inconvenience to them. I mean, when we're talking about how many women are raped and get pregnant and have an abortion, the number is quite small, actually. I think we're talking about less than 1% of the abortion population. This is the case, and I'm pretty sure that even most pro-lifers in many situations, not all, but many pro-lifers usually are willing to give an exception to the rule. That if they say that they don't want to have abortions, then there's a good reason that there are still good reasons why maybe perhaps in certain situations you should. Most of them would say that if the mother's life was in danger of giving birth and having an abortion would save her life, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find many that would say that no, she should still have the child and die in childbirth because of it. And if they are, they're kind of disgusting human beings in my point of view. But the problem is the number of abortions, and if we put it to the ratio of how many pregnancies happen in Canada every year. The data as it stands now is about 100,000 abortions every year in Canada. There's about 100,000, but there are about 385,000 pregnancies, roughly, every year in Canada. So somewhere between 300 and 400,000 pregnancies. So when we take those numbers, we are saying that about one-third to somewhere between one-quarter to one-third of pregnant women will end up getting an abortion every year in Canada. That's a large friggin' number. The thing is, too, is many people, when they end up getting pregnant, like many women, when they end up getting pregnant, they and their partner did not take the proper precautions in order to prevent it. There's so much sex that goes on these days where they're not using proper protection. They're not even a condom, which is probably, even though that one could fail, in conjunction with something like birth control, it nearly never fails. It nearly never fails if you're using birth control and a condom at the same time. And a condom is the best method in also to prevent the spread of STDs. This is something that the data has also shown, is that millennials are now more likely than previous generations to have a sexually transmitted disease of all sorts. It could be gonorrhea, it could be chlamydia, it could be crabs, it could be HIV, even though HIV is much more manageable these days. But this has become the new norm. This is because of the sort of society that we've developed where we say you can have sex with whoever you want. It's the hookup culture that we have brought into our society, and it's doing atrocious things. It's destroying the family unit because a lot of people now, especially a lot of men, are saying, why do I need to get married if I can just have sex whenever I want, and I can date a few people here and there in between if I so choose. But you don't really have to worry too much about getting married, having children, and in fact, the people who want to have children has been steadily declining, especially from generation to generation, including millennials. Millennials are less likely to want to have children these days, but there are good reasons to actually want to have children. I mean, you need somebody to look after you when you're in your older age. This is a problem that we're starting to see now, and it's going to get worse over the last few years. That because from the baby boomers, that their parents ended up having so many kids. We're talking, 5 kids or so, maybe more, and there are plenty of families that are much bigger. So they had their kids, and then many of them decided they're not going to have any children of their own. So now they're becoming an elderly population, and they don't have the medical care to look after them. In a lot of ways, this is the fault of the baby boomer generation. When they decided that they were not going to have children, that's their prerogative. If they don't want to have kids, fine. But then at the same time, the resources are not going to be there to look after you when you're in your old age. But this is also because many people these days, all they do is they look to put their parents into a home, into an old age home where they pay abhorrent amounts of money every single year to be looked after. But in our culture in the West, we don't really have that culture where you look after your parents when they start to get into elderly ages, where you take them into your home and then you're the one who looks after them, make sure they're okay. This is sort of the way it worked for a long period of time. It was, in a lot of ways, your parents looked after you when you were kids, when you were too young to look after yourself and you couldn't provide for yourself. You couldn't make money in order to fund your own lifestyle. So they looked after you. So when your parents reached old age, they couldn't work anymore. They couldn't make the money to look after themselves, and they're too elderly to be able to do many things for themselves. You have to look after them. You have to bring them into your home and do things for them. These are just some of the issues when it comes to the way that things are going these days. Higher STDs, higher elderly population, and we don't have the resources or the people to look after that elderly population. But a lot of the excuses given these days for abortion, to me, just are not acceptable. They really aren't acceptable because the people will use these excuses when really for them it's just an inconvenience. They want to be able to go out, sleep around with whoever they want, and then not take responsibility for whenever a pregnancy happens. And this is not restricted to one gender or the other. This is in both ways. There's many fathers who are no longer there to raise their children. There are many mothers who just would rather get an abortion than have to deal with the consequences of sex. But this is something that has to be taken in consideration if you're going to engage sexually. If you do get somebody pregnant and they are going to give birth to a child, you have to be there to look after your child. And because of this, too, I mean, we already have the problem of too many abortions, but of the kids that do get born, because they don't have a stable household, it leads them down bad paths in lives. You can definitely trace back a lot of the problems that people had because of unsteady households. And this doesn't have to be just because one family member wasn't there, maybe the father was gone or the mother was gone, so they didn't have that stability in the household. But even it could be that if the parents are not very stable together. If the parents are just bad for each other, they're constantly fighting, they don't really like each other, then I too in my personal life have seen how this sort of action has led kids down bad paths. I've watched it happen to some of my own friends. But this was the first situation where, the first case where somebody committed an act of violence against a woman who was pro-life. And judging just from the look, I don't know for a fact, but my guess is that this guy, Jordan Hunt, considers himself pro-life. He considers himself a male feminist, just judging by the look. They kind of have a look to them, which to me, a male feminist is just a sneaky human being for the most part. Not always. Of course, they may have legitimate reasons why they consider themselves as such, but many of them consider themselves to be the nice guys, and that eventually the women they'll realize that all these other guys are assholes, and they'll come date them. But there's a number of male feminists who also believe that they should have this free ride. That because they're there fighting for women, because they're there being the nice guys, maybe some of these women should just throw them a free fuck every now and then. So they're actually quite sneaky. I've heard the comparison several different times from several different people that it's like a type of fish. There's a type of fish where what it does is it pretends to be a female fish, while all the male fish are kind of out doing their thing. So what it does is it pretends to be a female fish, and then it kind of sneaks in, and then sneakily under the eye, just underneath the nose of the other male fishes, it'll have sex with the female fish that's there. It'll impregnate them so that way the female fish lays its egg. I wish I could tell you which fish it was right now. I really can't remember, but a lot of people have compared it to this, that male feminists are like these people who just try and sneak in, pretend to be allies and friends to the women, but really they're just trying to bang them. But this was the first situation, and Jordan Hunt ended up getting arrested for what he ended up doing. There was police ended up doing an investigation into him, and he eventually turned himself into the police. Man accused of kicking woman at anti-abortion rally faces slew of assault mischief charges. A man allegedly caught on a viral video doing a roundhouse kick and striking a woman in the shoulder during an anti-abortion rally, knocking her phone out of her hands, has been arrested by Toronto police. Jordan Hunt, 26, of Toronto, surrendered to police on Saturday. And this ended up coming out on the 6th of October, so it was just this past Saturday that he surrendered. He faces 8 counts of assault and 7 counts of mischief under $5,000 relating to the Life Choice demonstration last Sunday afternoon at Keele and Bloor Street. Constable David Hopkins confirmed the mischief charges related to posters defaced with a magic marker, while the 7 counts of assault, besides the one stemming from the purported roundhouse kick, are a result of Hunt allegedly scribbling on clothing of protesters. And that's what I was talking about just a little bit earlier, about how he did commit other acts besides just that one, where he actually did write on the clothing of several people, including one as young as, I believe it was 10 years old. A 10-year-old girl he ended up doing this to. Hunt has also been charged with 1 count of assault in a separate incident on August 2nd. However, Hopkins could not confirm whether it was in relation to a second video that surfaced earlier this week, showing a man who was harassing other anti-abortion protesters. In that case, police say, a group of anti-abortionists were protesting around noon near Dufferin and Dundas Street, where they were approached by a man on a bike who tried to grab one of their signs and then pushed a woman into a pool before fleeing the scene. Hunt, who was previously identified as a Toronto hairdresser on social media, appeared at Old City Hall courts Saturday. Police didn't know when his next appearance would be. Hunt, who deleted his social media account, was fired by Noble Studio 101, a hair salon near Queen Street West and Brock Avenue, who released a statement on Wednesday saying he'd been caught on camera assaulting an innocent bystander at a pro-life rally. We don't condone this action, and he has been let go. And this is the other attack they're trying to say that might be Hunt here.
You can't harm somebody else. You can't get physical. You can disagree with somebody's message.
If you walk out into the world and harass people, then you get harassed back.
I got it. When women talk about women's
tried to take that away
rights,
from you, tried to take all your pamphlets away from you. Arguably, that is wrong. Yeah, I try to knock your stupid billboard of the sign.
Okay.
So if you don't want me to fuck with your stuff, why are you deciding to fuck with other people's choices?
So that's video there. But the other thing is that at some point, that just going to talk about what the sort of thing that he said, that was said in that video, is that at some point you have to admit that it is a life. At some point you have to admit that the growth inside you is not just a set of cells anymore, but is in fact a human life. So when they say things like you don't want people to screw with your stuff, they can stop screwing with other people's stuff, it doesn't really work out that well, because at the same time, you are screwing with the life of a baby who cannot do anything to protect itself. It relies on the protection of the mother in order to do that. So it's one thing if people want to talk about an abortion when it is just a set of cells, but it's another thing when we're talking about. It's quite another thing when we're talking about it's been formed for a while, because it doesn't take too long for the heartbeat to start, or the brain to start having activity. And these are all things that would suggest life, but people are willing to have an abortion even after this fact. And in Canada, the other thing about it is there is no law dictating abortions, which means that you can have one through every step of your pregnancy. Meaning if you were a week away from giving birth, you could have that baby aborted. Now, this is a much smaller number, though. It pretty much as it goes through trimester, the first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, the number gets smaller, number of abortions. So most abortions actually happen in the first trimester. Then the second largest number happens in second, and then it's very few actually that happen in the third. So I'm not going to pretend like this is something that ends up like a lot of late-term abortions happen. But there is no law. Ever since R.V. Morgentaler, they struck down any laws in Canada surrounding abortion, which is actually a very concerning thing. That was something I remember not learning about in my law class back in high school. I remember learning about the Morgentaler case, but they never once told me, at least I don't remember them telling me, that in fact they had actually struck down all laws surrounding abortion. They would just say, oh, that's when abortions became legal in Canada, and pretty much glossed over the rest. And it was around this time that after this video came out, not the second one we saw, but the first one of Jordan Hunt, where he roundhouse kicks the woman, it was around this time we saw the return of Canada's favorite villain. Who I'm talking about? I'm talking about Nora Loreto. If that name rings a bell to anybody, you would probably remember her from the Humboldt Broncos tragedy that ended up happening. You would remember it because she was the one that pretty much tried to claim that the only reason that the people were sad that 15 or 16, I can't remember which one it was, kids ended up getting killed in this tragedy was because of the maleness, the youthfulness, the whiteness. She ended up putting out this tweet after the crash, and the first one is talking about the amount of money that was raised from the GoFundMe page. It says that they had already surpassed $4 million. And her quote is, "This is a lot of money." Nothing wrong with that. She's absolutely right. That is a lot of money to be raised for this. Then she ends up going on to say, "I'm not trying to get cynical about what is totally devastating tragedy, but the maleness, the youthfulness, and the whiteness of the victims are, of course, playing a significant role. I don't want less for the families or survivors of the tragedy. I want justice, and more so for the grievous parents and the communities." So this is something that she ended up saying, and it got a lot of lashback. A lot of people were unhappy with what she ended up saying because she was politicizing a tragedy. It really was a tragedy because these kids were kids. They weren't adults yet, and because of one dumb driver who ended up crashing into them, they ended up losing their lives, and the ones who survived faced huge recovery times in order to return to where they were before. Many of them have found it difficult to play the sport again. And even if they are playing the sport, they don't have the skill level that they did have before. So many people thought this was disgusting. But you can bet that she ended up getting in on this whole situation. With this woman getting kicked by Jordan Hunt. So she ends up saying, when someone was replying to her saying that she's pretty much victim blaming, she says, "Yes, I am blaming her for provoking someone into attacking her. Correct. I have zero use for these shitty gonzo tactics that make you guys all lose your minds. What these goons want the state to do to women is a million times worse." So that's what she has to say on the subject. And somebody ended up actually calling her out on it and says, "Ladies, stop provoking men into abusing you. When you have had bad opinion, it makes some men sad, and then they have to beat the shit out of you." That is actually a perfect way to do it. She is victim blaming. She is saying that this woman was asking for it. Now, I remember that there have been several different situations where people have said something similar. Men, actually, in fact, have said something similar about certain rape victims. And imagine the lashback that they got. She should get no less for saying that this woman was asking for it. Sure, it's not a rape allegation, but it is without a doubt an assault allegation, a vicious assault allegation. And Nora Loreto is saying she was asking for it. What a shitty thing to say. But she goes on. "Anti-abortion activists aren't seen as the radical woman haters they really are, probably because so many of them are women. Men hide behind that and help to soften the movement's image. And with no women's movement, these spin out and get weird. Things spin out and get weird." So let's just analyze what she said here at the top. She said, "Anti-abortion activists aren't seen as the radical woman haters they really are, probably because so many of them are women." So, by effect, she's saying that so many women are actually woman haters. How does that make sense? And they call them radical. Well, they're not the ones that are going out and committing acts of violence. As it stands, many of them do non-violent protests. They use some pretty nasty imagery, to be perfectly honest. I don't really like the imagery that they'll just put out in the public. I think it's I can be over the top sometimes, but I don't believe that they can be considered radical just for doing something like this. Really, all they're doing is they're showing a lot of times is they're showing the images of fetuses as they're being produced and stuff, or after an abortion, which it's just gross to see. But they're trying to make their point that this is what an abortion truly is, because people like to act like it's no big deal, like it's nothing. But according to Nora Loretto, a number of women who don't support the pro-choice movement are women haters in and of themselves. I don't really know how that works, but apparently in her twisted world, that's exactly how it works. And Nora Loretto is just, I can't believe that she still has a job. I mean, she's a freelance journalist, so she isn't employed by one place or the other. But she has been employed by a number of different media sources. Like, they at least hire her on to do an article here or there, or to do a report here and there. She's just not a full-time member of their team. But she didn't get in fact, they played her off during the Humboldt Broncos situation. The media tried to play her off as the victim, as if she was the victim of such nasty online hate, simply because she had an opinion on the subject. Now, nobody in that situation tried to actually take away her right to speak her mind. But what comes with freedom of speech is that if you do say something and it's controversial, it's stupid, then you do receive the lashback over it. This happens constantly, all the fucking time. But people are trying to say that just because she spoke her mind, she receives so much lashback. Well, welcome to the fucking world. This is what people do. If you like what somebody says, you will go on and tell them differently. And it happens to everybody. It happens to men. It happens to women. But whenever it happens to someone such as someone such as Nora Loretto, they like to act as if it's unique to someone like her. Because she's a woman, she's going to receive so much hate. It reminds me a little bit of when Jordan Peterson did the Channel 4 interview with Kathy Newman. And then people were trying to suggest that, Kathy Newman received so much hate online. It was terrible. They had to call security to protect her. When in reality, if you went and looked for the hate against her, you couldn't really find it. But Jordan Peterson got a lot of hate, and nobody reported on that. Doesn't matter whether you like Jordan Peterson or dislike Jordan Peterson. The point is they tried to play Kathy Newman as the victim when she wasn't the victim in that situation. She received significantly less hate than Jordan Peterson did, but he didn't make a fuss over it. Now we get into what has been the second attack that has taken place over the last little bit, since the beginning of the month. So, this was a tweet that was put out by a woman named Katie. So, she ended up saying that the Jordan Hunt assault hits close to home for me. The very next day, I was assaulted at Ryerson University. This is the state of free speech in Ontario. Pro-choice violence at Ryerson. Gabby Swarco, Toronto against abortion. So, she didn't really link the video in here. But somebody did. Somebody down in the comments ended up asking her and said, here it is. Was this you who was assaulted here? And links to it. And she says, yes, that's me. So she's confirming that the video that was linked to, this video here, is the video of her getting assaulted. So let's watch it.
I call it the organism.
Like, I don't think we should have a right to kill somebody else.
Maybe deal with the shit that's causing the abortions in the first place.
That's if we take it out in one piece, right? But how did an abortion, how are they taken out?
What an abortion does is they're not taking it out, they're terminating it, and then the cells are being reabsorbed by the body.
I would argue that because in abortion, they have to collect...
Gabby.
Yo, relax.
Let's go.
Yo, relax.
Come on. Let's do it. You filming me?
What's that?
Let's do it.
Yo, relax. Come on, let's keep the. Relax, everyone. Relax, come on, let's relax. Let's be respectful, man. You know, whatever happens.
Dude, why are you blocking the assault, man? Come on, that's messed up.
So I will correct a quick error that I made earlier in this episode so far, is that I thought that the second video was also a man attacking this woman, Katie. It turns out that it is a woman, although it is, as you can see, it is quite hard to tell for the person who's attacking this woman, Katie. But that is, it's a disgusting thing to do. It's absolutely disgusting. And you can tell that this resonated a lot with Katie because of what she says near the end of the video.
Relax, everyone.
So that's Katie there, just on the very edge of your screen. Hold on, I can adjust this a little more for you. There we go. That's her. She is in tears because she just got attacked. And she even says, no, it's not okay. No, it isn't. It is not okay. Excuse me just for a second. Sorry about that. Just had a tickle in my throat. It's not okay that this woman, Katie, was assaulted viciously simply for holding a different point of view than her. The thing is, too, is that's killing me is this abortion activist right here. The one who assaulted her. This woman right here. I would be shocked. I'm going to do an ad hominem right now, and I really don't give a fuck. I would be shocked if any guy of any sort fucked her in her life. Because she is just a disgusting human being, both inside and outside. So this is the point that we're at, that it's completely okay for someone like Katie to be assaulted simply for her point of view. But there's next to no repercussions in a lot of situations. I haven't heard any repercussions that have taken place to this. It's one thing if we're talking about Jordan Hunt, which was public and viral. This one, it did get a fair amount of views, but not nearly as much as... not nearly the amount that the Jordan Hunt ended up doing. The Jordan Hunt was spread all over online. And I think one of the reasons is because he happened to be a man who was hitting a woman, so that a lot of people were making more of a deal out of that than a woman attacking another woman. But it's just as disgusting. It's just as bad. And I feel bad for this poor girl, Katie, who is just out here trying to express her point of view, who has the same democratic right as the other woman who assaulted her, yet she is being assaulted simply because of her point of view. And this is the world that we live in these days. It's gotten worse. It's definitely gotten worse since 2010. And one reason is definitely has to do with the indoctrination that comes with university and college campuses. This was at Ryerson University. So with all their Marxist professors out there, it's no wonder that this is the case, that so many of them end up getting assaulted like this. But it's just a shame. But even ones who hold this point of view, even if they're not assaulted, they are completely condemned. They are completely condemned simply for holding these points of view. This is from andrewlawton.ca. Professor tells BC student discussing abortion in class is hateful and unsafe from September 27th to 2018. Discussing abortion is hateful and threatens classroom safety, according to comments contained in leaked audio of a meeting between a former University of the Fraser Valley graduate student and two of her professors. Valerie Flockstra, a recent graduate of UFV's Teachers Education Program, was summoned to a meeting with a professor and her department head in December after citing a medical statistic related to abortion during a classroom discussion. Students were told premature births were contributed to increased autism diagnosis. Flockstra questioned whether high abortion rates in Canada could be playing a role, citing studies showing a link between abortion and later premature births. Asking that Asking that made the classroom an unsafe space, the 22-year-old was told. Flockstra covertly recorded the hour-long meeting with Professor Nancy Norman, in whose class the incident took place, and Professor Vandy Britton, the head of the teacher's education department. Fearing academic reprisal, she waited until her graduation to share the audio. She now works as a teacher at a British Columbia private school. So, and again, this is something that they're facing. The fact that she even was worried that her education would be put into question simply because of her point of view, simply because she happened to be pro-life, is concerning. Why would they ever have to call into question her education because of her point of view? This is stupid. This is the point we're getting to, and I don't really think there's anything more I can really say when we're talking about what a lot of pro-life women are facing right now. I mean, it's just pro-life in general. I mean, I'm sure men get this too, but it's just over the last little bit, I've been noticing a number of pro-life women who have been getting this sort of assault, this sort of destruction of their character, simply because they don't agree with the way things are right now, with the unrestricted abortion and the amount of abortion that ends up happening. And she's citing statistics. Those are medical studies that have been done that uses data to back them up, and they're saying she is hateful because of it. Shows the state of Canada, and it shows the state of our universities right now. So in the U.S., the Brett Kavanaugh nomination that was going on was an absolute shit show. It was extremely polarizing. You were either on Dr. Ford's side, who was accusing Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault, or you were on Brett Kavanaugh's side, saying that this was a situation that was pretty much being used to try and destroy him and his career. Now, personally, I kind of stayed out of it. I didn't really comment. I kind of watched it from the edges. But I did think that the way that Dr. Ford was going about it was quite suspicious. She ends up putting this accusation forward, and then they want to bring her up in order to speak to the committee. But then she was using all these reasons why she couldn't make it out, or she needed this to be put in place. She needed to be sure that she was protected, blah, 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 blah. It was just so much that she was doing, going out of her way, it seemed, to try and avoid speaking to the committee. Then she eventually does. She eventually speaks to the committee, and she talks about how she's going to bring in these witnesses. They talk to the witnesses, 4 of her friends, who don't actually corroborate anything she said. In fact, they probably did more damage to her testimony than good, because they said that they either didn't know or didn't think that it happened when it came to Brett Kavanaugh. So that was kind of interesting. And for me, the final straw was right after Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed that he was voted into office to be member of the Supreme Court. It turns out that Dr. Ford was no longer going to be pursuing this against Brett Kavanaugh. And that, to me, was the most suspicious part, is that she's putting up such a fuss. She doesn't say anything for about 30 years. Then suddenly he's about to go to the Supreme Court. And then she comes in to say, oh, he sexually assaulted me. Yeah, he raped me. And then as soon as he's confirmed, she's saying, nah, I'm not going to be pursuing this any farther. Why wouldn't you? If you waited so long to come forward and then finally came forward, why then would you not pursue it any farther? You figure now, actually, she'd be doubling down, because not only she tried to get him to prevent him from getting on the Supreme Court, and then he does get on the Supreme Court. You figure now she'd be like, whoa, well, he's deciding the fate of many other people now, because the Supreme Court is the highest court in both Canada and America. So now I need to try harder to actually take him down and expose him to the world. You would think that. But that's not how it went down. Anyway, so the amount of protest that went on because of Brett Kavanaugh was huge. And many are trying to use this situation as a way to try and galvanize people. Well, before I get into that too much, the amount of death threats that was received by people who voted for Brett Kavanaugh is concerning. There were people who were doxxed, like even though they're a member of the government, they had their personal addresses and their family addresses put out. One senator who voted for this ended up receiving a picture that was photoshopped to show his wife getting beheaded. So there was just total huge amount of death threats that were put out against people who voted for Brett Kavanaugh. And for the Democrats, there was 1 or 2 Democrats who actually voted to say yes to Brett Kavanaugh. They were they also received a lot of lashback too. Huge amounts, because they were considered traitors now. But anyway, women groups aim to use the Kavanaugh rage to boost voter turnout. As women rallied at the U.S. Capitol to protest Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court on Saturday, activist Linda Sarsour flew to Washington to Texas with her eyes on the next challenge, November 6th congressional election. Sarsour, a leader of the Women's March organization, said it was time to harness women's furor around Kavanaugh to galvanize voters in races that will soon determine which party controls Congress. Quote, "This is not the end," Sarsour, 38, said in a telephone interview. "I think the rage will be translated into mass voter turnout." Now let's just take a look at some of the video footage of the that went down at the Kavanaugh protests.
Easy.
Yes.
Easy.
Yes.
Easy.
Yes.
Great job.
Here we go.
These are live images, folks, at the doors of the Supreme Court, where you can see protesters have gathered. They are demanding that their voices be heard as they anticipate the person who will be a new Supreme Court justice, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, to be sworn in here any moment. In a bigger picture, you can see approximately how many people who have gathered there. It looks like there are dozens, and they are chanting, "Kavanaugh has got to go," is what I'm hearing them say. You see, there is high security there. As we look at these pictures, I want to bring in with me here Ariane DeVogue and Julie Pace. Ariane, when you look at these pictures, having covered the Supreme Court for so long, have you ever seen anything like this?
Well, I'll tell you this, you're usually not allowed on those stairs. You're not allowed up there. We did see the night he was nominated, there was a peaceful protest where people were allowed.
Okay, well, that was just a brief picture of what was going on there. There was a lot of rage that was going on. And what was most concerning about this is that a number of people ended up actually pretty much throwing Brett Kavanaugh under the bus without proper due process, which is something very concerning. As soon as Dr. Ford came forward, it didn't matter. It did not matter what his point of, whether it was true or false. The point is that the accusation was made, and because of it, he was immediately condemned in the court of public opinion. He was immediately guilty in the court of public opinion. And many are trying, as we were hearing from Linda Sarsour and others, they were going to try and use this as a way of galvanizing support for him. But for those who know him, the independent journalist Tim Pool ended up doing a take on this. And it's quite interesting because Tim Pool also considered himself something about center-left or so. That's where he's, in his own words, he's kind of said that his position is he's about center-left. But he saw the real problems with this going on, especially considering how we didn't see any violence taking place right here, but there were a number of violent acts that took place. That people were having their own private property destroyed, or they were being assaulted because of this, which is something that's becoming increasingly common with the left wing of politics, that they're going to commit acts of violence in order to try and get their point of view across. But Tim Pool ended up doing a bit on this, and I thought it was very well done, so we're going to take a quick look into what he had to say.
I feel like the left is its own worst enemy, because they keep doing things that hurt themselves. With the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, we've got people calling for mobilization and riots if he is confirmed. But we know for a fact that riots make people vote conservative. I have the data to back that up. We even saw riots all throughout the country leading up to the 2016 election. And I'm not saying that's the reason Trump got elected, but I bet it absolutely did contribute. We also have data from NPR showing that the Kavanaugh-Ford hearing roused the GOP base and took away the Democrats' advantage in the midterm elections. If they keep engaging in this behavior, they're going to hurt themselves more and more, and it's possible the Republicans will just maintain control. Remember how everyone was talking about how progressives were taking over the Democratic Party? Well, now we have data to show that these progressives did terribly. That's backfiring on the Democrats. By any means necessary, and a diversity of tactics are threads that are common among the far left. When people get violent and smash windows, start fires, and attack people, many organizers on the left say, respect the diversity of tactics. It's something I've heard time and time again as I've been on the ground in these protests. And all this does is justify violence that strengthens the right. Yet for whatever reason, they keep saying it's okay, they allow it to happen, they won't call out the violence. Bernie Sanders, Noam Chomsky, and Chris Hedges have all called out that violence. New York Magazine ran this story in 2015. New study shows riots make America conservative. They highlight this image from Baltimore, Maryland, April 28th, 2015. I was there. It was violent. This image is an accurate depiction of what it was like on the ground. The story highlights that when there were non-violent protests, public opinion on civil rights skyrocketed, straight up. However, when there were violent protests and arrests, public opinion on social control skyrocketed. Is it a shock to anyone that getting violent would scare people, would make them want to vote for law and order candidates? And when the left doesn't call this out, is it surprising to anyone that people are going to say, I don't want to be aligned with the people who are violent?
So in my opinion, I find that Tim Pool really hit the nail on the head there. Is he exposes the problems of doing this sort of action that the left wing of politics really wants to bring into play. They want to bring into play this idea that if you cause a bunch of social outcries, then you will galvanize people to support you. But this is not the situation that we're seeing. As he even states that they may have actually hurt themselves for the upcoming election for Congress. The congressional election is coming up in just under a month in America, November 6th. But because of all the violence that has taken place, and because of the fact that the left wing of politics has refused to call out certain groups such as Black Lives Matter or Antifa, in fact, in a lot of ways, they've supported these groups as they commit their acts of violence. It actually does the opposite. That it's actually causing more people to get away from that sort of politics, which is why you're seeing movements such as the walk away movements, which is people around the world, mostly in America. It really did start in America. Why people are saying that they're walking away from their liberal parties, from the Democratic Party, for instance, and saying why they're no longer supporting them. And this is also something that the media is doing. For a long time, the media was supporting Antifa. It only has happened more recently that they've started to call them out on what they're doing. But the Antifa is still out there, and the people on the left wing of politics are allowing them to go out there and commit these acts, and they don't say anything about it. But this is the problem with that, especially when they start attacking people that have nothing to do with what they are against. So when they start going out and they attack pedestrians, bystanders, old people, simply because they're not doing what they would tell them to do, then this actually has the opposite reaction. And a perfect example is the fact that Antifa, I don't think this was related to the Brett Kavanaugh situation, but they were out in the streets of Portland, I believe it was, and the police were nowhere around. Because this is something that is also happening a lot, is the police are getting these stand-down orders where they're told not to do anything to prevent these people from committing their acts of violence. So they go out, and in Portland, I believe it had something to do, they were protesting that another black man was shot by police. I think this is what ended up being the protest over it. But they were trying to direct traffic. And in one situation where an old man, they were trying to direct him to not go a certain way, when he decided that he was going to just say, screw it, I'm going this way, I don't care what you say, they attacked his car, and they did some $3,000 worth of damage. People aren't going to support you if this is the actions you are taking, if this is what you are doing. So Tim Pool really nailed it on the head, and in a lot of ways, this is just going to backfire on the Democrat Party, on the left wing of politics, because people aren't going to support them. And we're even seeing this in Canada in a lot of ways. People are not only tired of the left wing politicians and their bullshit that they push, but now they're all even getting tired because we have these groups that are popping up. And because of it, liberal strongholds in Canada have been completely demolished. This is what happened in Ontario when Doug Ford was elected in. The Liberals held Ontario for 15 years, and they held it with 55 seats. Suddenly, they were knocked down to 7 seats, which didn't even give them official party status. And this is similar to what happened in Quebec recently, where the CAQ ended up winning their election, and Quebec was another one of these governments that they hadn't had a conservative government or a right-wing government since like the 1960s or something. It has been decades since then. And even those who are still a liberal stronghold are turning against the liberal governments, like the federal liberal governments. We're having this in the carbon tax right now, because right now over on our East Coast in the Maritimes, a number of liberal mayors, liberal premiers are turning on Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. And the rally against the carbon tax is just skyrocketing these days, especially when you have governments such as Jason Kenney, he's not a government right now, but from the look of things, he's going to demolish the NDP government in Alberta. When you have Scott Moe in Manitoba, I believe it is, and when you have Doug Ford in Ontario, these are 3 big provinces that are coming together, and they're rallying people to their side because of it. So the left wing of politics is really faltering in Canada. Alrighty, so the next little story I want to talk about has to do with, we're going a little, again, into the immigration debate. So when it comes to immigration, we've been having the problems with Roxham Road for some time, and it hasn't slowed down. It's still going on. Almost 2 years down the road, we're having people crossing into our country illegally, and then they're giving all the benefits of being here, despite the fact that they are breaking the law to enter our country, which is kind of ironic that the first thing they do when they enter our country is break the law. Now, people are trying to say that they're fleeing persecution. They're fleeing persecution, but clearly this is not the case, and this has even been proven by Senator Linda Frum. She's a senator for the Conservative Party in the upper house of Canada. So she put out a tweet that ended up saying that over 65% of illegal border crossers from 2017 to 2018 had legal status in the United States before illegally entering into Canada. Trudeau needs to fix this mess, and not with free hotel rooms in Canada. Now, in my last broadcast, I showed the video that was put out of what the situation was in these hotel rooms. I showed that in these hotel rooms, they were a mess, that people were pissed off because these high-ranking hotels were suddenly getting terrible reviews because of the type of people that were staying in them, and even how there was segregation, because the people in those videos, as they were going around and on one floor, they had a Muslim woman who told them that you can't be on this floor, you have to change floors, which says a lot about these type of people coming in. They're pro-segregation. But then what really brings me to this was a tweet that was put out by Candace Malcolm. Candace Malcolm, who works for the Toronto Sun, and she also is the founder of the True North Initiative. She ended up saying, the feds are urging non-citizens to vote, and I obtained evidence. An asylum seeker who has only been in Canada for 18 months received a registration card from Elections Canada, urging her to register for the feds' next election. And where it's there here, I think. Yeah. Yep. So it's this one right here. So it says, an asylum seeker who has only been in Canada for 18 months was sent a voter registration card from Elections Canada, the Sun has learned. The letter, dated September 12, 2018, and addressed to Jacqueline, a woman who arrived in Canada in the spring of 2017, informs her that she is, quote, not currently registered to vote in federal elections, end quote. The letter urges her to register by October 23, 2018, saying that registering in advance will ensure you're on the voters list and will save you time at the polls. It is not clear how Jacqueline ended up in an Election Canada list. The Sun has chosen not to identify Jacqueline's last name as her refugee case is pending, and public identification could put the outcome of such cases at risk. Her and her husband are asylum seekers from Mexico and have not yet received permanent immigration status in Canada. Jacqueline's husband said he has threatened and that he was threatened and assaulted by members of the drug cartel, including a police officer. The son has chosen not to name him due to the pending refugee status and claims of threats of life. The couple fled to Canada and ended up in Western Canada, where the husband applied for a temporary work permit and has found a job working in the oil industry. The couple's refugee application is still pending. Their case has yet to presented to an immigration and refugee board judge. If their application is accepted, they will become permanent residents and will have to wait at least 3 years before they can apply for Canadian citizenship, making them eligible to vote. And yet, somehow, the woman ended up on a federal election Canada registration list. Quote, I don't know where they got her information to begin with, but they sent her a registration card, end quote, said Jacqueline's husband, who was interviewed because his wife who still struggles with English. She's taking English second language classes. We haven't even been in the country a year and a half, and the Liberals are sending a vote registration card. According to her husband, this isn't an isolated incident. They're doing this with a lot of immigrants because I have a few friends that are on the work permit and they also receive vote registration cards. That's part of the reason he came forward to blow the whistle on possible voter fraud. Having escaped Mexico, a deeply corrupt country that struggles with the rule of law, he doesn't want to see Canada go in that direction. Quote, I want to give something back to Canada. Canada has done so much for us, and we don't want to see Canada go in that direction. That's not fair to Canadians. So first off, I want to bring up the fact that this seems to me, a legitimate refugee status, where these people were fleeing persecution from Mexico because they were assaulted by the drug cartel and even by a police officer. If that turns out to be true, then absolutely this is a refugee in every sense of the word, an asylum seeker in every sense of the word, not like the ones that we're seeing coming across Roxham Road, because a number of them are still legally viable in the U.S., many more who are not legally viable, they have actually been, it's because they had their temporary work status taken away, and because of it, they are also, have not gone to try and seek proper citizenship in the U.S., proper visas in the U.S. They just decide they're going to run to Canada. And probably a number of it has to do with the way that we treat our people who come in our country. We don't really just deport them off the bat. We actually give them residency. We give them money. We give them access to healthcare. And a number of these immigrants are using it they're using it because it's free money for them. So that's why they're doing this. But in the case of Jacqueline and her husband, it seems to me like it is an actual legitimate asylum case. But this is what Trudeau is doing with his new legislation that he's putting in when it comes to the Voting Act, when it comes to the Canada Elections Act, sorry. Liberals planning voter ID changes incredibly concerning. The opposition Conservatives are ringing the alarm bell following an exclusive Sun report revealing that Election Canada sent a voter registration card to an asylum seeker who has only been in Canada for 18 months. Concern over possible voter fraud continues in light of the Trudeau government's plan to weaken voter integration measures and make it easier for non-citizens to vote in the 2019 election. This has to do with the fact that your voting registration card is enough. And I saw this too when I went to vote in previous elections, because that's all you had to bring. I brought my ID and everything, but I didn't even need it. All I did is show them the card, and that's good enough. There are concerning reasons for this, because as we are seeing, people who do not officially have the ability to vote in Canada, they're getting these voter registration cards, which means that all they have to do is show up and vote for whoever they want. And it has been pretty much proven that a number of people that come from other parts of the world will vote for bigger government, vote for the left-wing politicians, because they're more likely to get benefits from that government. More welfare, more child's aid, which we're seeing actually from Justin Trudeau. Not too long ago, he announced the changes to the Child Protection Plan, I believe it was called. And in that case, they were going to start giving more money to people with children. Well, it is a bunch of the immigrants coming across who have the most kids. Some of them have 4, 5, 6, 7 kids, sometimes more. And the more kids you have, the more money you'll get from the government. Of course, Justin Trudeau tried to play this off as it's completely tax-free, when in fact it's taxpayers' money that's paying for it. So it was a complete lie when he ended up saying that. But these are the sort of changes that they're bringing in with Bill C-76. Now, Bill C-76 hasn't been passed yet. It's still in progress. But if it does get passed, which is a good possibility considering that the Liberals have a majority government in the House of Commons, which means all that Trudeau has to do is whip his party into voting for the way that he wants, which he's proven he's willing to do many, many times, then it's very likely that this bill will end up getting passed. It's a very concerning way to go about it. And even for those that are, even those refugees that are in Canada right now, it's going to be forever before they finally get processed and whether they can or cannot stay in Canada. Because a report that came from the Nectarine ended up saying refugee must wait until 2030 before claim hearing, according to Immigration and Refugee Board. The Immigration and Refugee Board in Montreal notified an asylum seeker that they would have to wait 12 years before their claim would be considered by the government. If you need to wait 12 years before your claim can be confirmed or denied by the government, then that's a pretty concerning point of view for how many people we have crossing our border right now, how backlogged our Immigration and Refugee Board truly is. Because if it was actually keeping up with how many people are coming into Canada, it wouldn't take this long. In fact, in a lot of ways, and most of the time, they say it takes about a year to 18 months or so for your claim to be processed as an asylum seeker. So the fact that this is backing people up to 12 years shows how backlogged we really are, and this has to do with people just crossing the border and Justin Trudeau and his government doing nothing about it. But that's because their handler, George Soros, doesn't want them to do anything about it. In fact, this is exactly the sort of thing that George Soros supports. He supports this sort of thing with his Open Society Foundation. Who do you think is pouring so much money into the Trudeau Trudeau Foundation right now? It's probably George Soros. Despite the fact they try and claim that it's John McCall McBain from the McCall McBain Foundation, who sits on the board of directors for the Trudeau Foundation, they try and say that all the money that has been given, because right now there's more foreign money being funded towards the Trudeau Foundation than domestic money. And they're trying to suggest that it's all coming from this one person, John McCall McBain, and his foundation. But you know that's bullcrap. You know it's coming from other people. And you can definitely bet that George Soros is putting his money in towards the Trudeau Foundation, because this is exactly the sort of thing he does. I've said many times before in my personal life that I find that Trudeau is the Canada's version of Hillary Clinton. People like to compare him to Obama. I don't think this is right. I think it'd be closer to compare him more to Hillary Clinton, especially with the Trudeau Foundation and the Clinton Foundation. A lot of their similar dealings are quite shady. And let's not forget that Trudeau donated $20 million of taxpayer dollars to the Clinton Foundation. Don't ever forget that. So as this article goes on to say, the Immigration and Refugee Board in Montreal has recently notified an asylum seeker that they would have to wait until January 1st, 2030 before the refugee claim hearing. This would mean that the refugee would have to wait within the country for 12 years before getting a final answer on their applications. A lawyer says the date could be a tactic to discourage refugees. Unlikely, because this is once again, this is the sort of thing that Trudeau and his cronies do. Stephanie Hanfield, who is representing the claimant, speculated on Facebook that the date was a ministry error. Hanfield pointed out that January 1st is a holiday and that waiting times are normally between 12 and 18 months. Quote, hearing planned in 2030, it looks like this is a ministry error. However, today's colleagues inform me that they have received the same dates for certain files, so if wrong, it was committed in several cases. Is it possible that the ministry chose this date of 2030 to voluntarily discourage some asylum seekers and thus close files? In the circumstances, the question is legitimate. End quote. If this is the case and they're just trying to discourage asylum seekers, then really more than anything, it's the Trudeau government doing the bare fucking minimum to try and solve the border crisis right now. Because he hasn't done anything about it. He hasn't done anything. He could actually do something about it if he mobilized our Immigration and Refugee Board to start deporting people that enter our country illegally. But that's not what's ending up happening. However, a number of However, the number is not unheard of, as a memo released by the Immigration and Refugee Board last year revealed that current backlogs could lead to a wait time of 11 years for future claims and hearings. Hanfield has also suggested that the government is using a fictitious date to discourage refugee claimants from pursuing their cases. A recent influx of illegal border crossings into Quebec and Ontario has put a burden on federal and provincial governments to process and house the refugees. Since last year, the Canadian Border Service Agency has only deported 398 out of 32,173 illegal immigrants who did not have their claims approved. That's a significantly small number. That is a tiny fucking number right there. 398 out of 32,000. And personally, I think this number 32,000 is manipulated, because I swear I've heard different numbers. I swear I've heard that it was as high as 50,000. I've heard as high and then it drops to something about 32,000 and 30,000 and then 27,000. It just seems to me that in a lot of cases, the number keeps dropping, especially when it's coming from government sources. It just seems like that number just keeps going down and down and down and down. So, next little bit we want to get into, as I was talking about ISIS at the beginning, about how ISIS and how it affects Canada. Well, this is because, once again, we have more members of the more Canadians who went to go fight for the Islamic State and now want to return to Canada. But it looks like if they return to Canada, they're not going to face any sort of charges, despite the fact that there are sections inside the Canadian Charter, the Criminal Canadian Code, In the Canadian Criminal Code, it states that if you go to fight for a foreign country, then you can be charged underneath the code. So I don't know why they're having so many problems trying to lay charges. But as it says, Canadian members of the Islamic State caught, but RCMP struggled to lay charges against ISIS fighter. And they just got a quick little video here we're going to check out. Well, I was under the impression that this was supposed to be an interview that they actually gave. That's the way it made that's the way that Global News made it sound on Twitter. You can check out the exclusive interview, but it doesn't look like that's the case. All right, forget the video then. Forget it. All right. In an exclusive Global News series, Stuart Bell reported from Iraq and Syria on the aftermath of the war against the so-called Islamic State. Now, this right here, I don't like. They say the so-called Islamic State. They shouldn't put it that way, because it's well been called the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And it's many members who went to go fight for it. So it's not the so-called Islamic State, and even they themselves call themselves that. Even ISIS called themselves the Islamic State, and they were trying to put an Islamic caliphate in that area. So they were trying to downplay when they say the so-called Islamic State. In part 1, Global looks at Canadian ISIS members who are being held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the challenges Justin Trudeau's government faces with Canadian members of the terror group. A high-profile Canadian member of the so-called Islamic State has been caught while attempting to return to Canada, Global News has confirmed. Muhammad Ali, 28, who left Toronto in 2014 to join ISIS, was captured by Kurdish forces as he tried to flee from Syria to Turkey. Global News interviewed Ali at a makeshift prison where he is being held by the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the military alliance that controls northern Syria. Former Ryerson University student who went to Abu Turab al-Kanadi was taken into custody 4 months ago in Ras al-Ayan, on the Turkish border. Let's check out this video, see if it gives us anything.
My kids are the most important thing to me. We love
fucking ads. Always with the ads, aren't they? But it seems to me that when it comes to this guy here, Muhammad Ali. It seems to me that now that that ISIS has been more or less destroyed, or it's just a ghost of of its former self. It seems to me that he's just trying to return to Canada because he has nowhere else to go now. Now he's in a situation where the ISIS is no longer winning. ISIS is just a small group of people now. They're no longer actually protected by this huge force. So now it seems to me that he's worried about what's going to happen to him. So he wanted to return to Canada, and he's already probably heard the stories of ISIS fighters who have returned to Canada, how they have faced next to no problems returning home, and all they get is pretty much reintegration training. They're going to give them puppies and coloring books. And that's really a small price to pay for going over and fighting for ISIS. And it's disgusting what we're doing with that, because two reasons. The first one is because a while ago there was a report about how a Yazidi sex slave who was brought into Canada was riding the bus, and then she ended up seeing one of her captors on the bus too. She came to Canada to escape these people, and then she had to see the person who helped sell her into slavery and rape her. She had to see him riding the bus there too. She must have felt super unsafe when that ended up happening, and that must have brought up so many bad memories for her. So it's just absolutely ridiculous with that. And I had another point and then I forgot it, so let's watch the video.
We are coming and we will destroy you.
Burning Canadian passports. In this ISIS video, a former Calgarian is among the terrorists. Killed in a U.S.-led airstrike in 2015, we now know it's likely Farah Mohammed Sheridan was one of several Canadians targeted by the coalition, which includes Canada. Operation Impact Canadian Citizens and Targeting of ISIS Combatants reads this 2015 secret briefing note prepared for the Chief of Defence Staff and obtained by Global News. It's largely redacted but confirms Canadians have been targeted 3 times. It doesn't say whether the efforts to kill were successful.
Your document is the first I've ever seen acknowledging that there have been instances in which Canadians were part of a target package.
The document argues nationality is irrelevant even when fighters are Canadian because they are first and foremost enemy combatants.
We have to ask the question, I think, above and beyond the legal minimum, are there policy issues where we would decide to not kill Canadians, or in this case, kill Canadians? And that's the sort of debate that I think probably deserves to be much more open.
The secret document indicates there's more at stake. While the nationality is not an issue, domestic Canadian policy, political, and legal concerns may emerge. But the defense minister would only stick to the law when we asked several questions today.
We follow the laws of armed conflict, and this is something that is taught from day one.
Yes, there could be a justification, but the government would have to explain what happened exactly and the full context.
The U.S. and the U.K. have also conducted airstrikes against their own citizens. When 2 British ISIS fighters were killed, that country launched an investigation and published the results. Should the same happen here? The defense minister wouldn't answer that question.
So there you go. That's a little bit what they're talking about. And as this article goes on to say, says, at the time, he was with his Canadian wife, former Vancouver resident Rita Jabbar, and their 2 children, both born in Syria. His family is being detained at a camp not far from the prison where Kurdish, American, and British officials have been interrogating Ali. His capture is significant because, aside from serving as a sniper, Ali used social media to encourage others to join ISIS and conduct terrorist attacks. Ali's case has placed the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in a difficult position. Kurdish officials want to hand Ali and a dozen other Canadians over to Ottawa. However, the RCMP struggling to bring charges against Canadians who have taken part in overseas terror groups. There is no guarantee Ali would face arrest upon return. Kurdish authorities say that they are holding almost 900 foreign ISIS fighters, as well as 500 wives and more than 1,000 children, and want governments to take back those that are their citizens. And this is actually the other concern that we're having out of this. I remember my second point now that I forgot earlier, is the fact that because we're doing this, because of our mass migration and the type of people we bring in, and also we can put more specifically, the fact we're bringing over ISIS fighters, there's about 60 plus ISIS fighters back in Canada who left to go fight, which goes against our own values. Now they actually pose a danger to America. America is starting to wise up, and they're looking to us and seeing how there are situations where people are crossing over from Canada into America to commit terrorist attacks down there. So that is a very, very concerning situation as well. And this is just going to erode our relations with America even more than they already are under the Trudeau government. So they want to bring this guy back, but they don't think they can place charges against him. But he's not the only one. What's actually amazing is the fact of how many ISIS fighters have decided they don't want to return to their country of origin. They want to come to Canada. And this was released from The Guardian on the 6th of October 2018. Suspected British ISIS fighter could face repatriation to Canada. Dual nation Jack Leeds, 23, dubbed Jihadi Jack, is thought to have been included in recent agreement. Suspected Islamic State fighter Jack Leeds, nicknamed Jihadi Jack by the British media, is likely to be repatriated to Canada rather than the UK, sources have told The Guardian. The 23-year-old dual national has included in a recent agreement between Ottawa and the Kurdish administration in northeastern Syria to take home an estimated 11 Canadian citizens being held by its forces, several Kurdish and Canadian sources said. The Canadian effort to get Leeds out of Syria were a stark contrast to UK government's policy of repatriating ISIS suspects and their family. Kurdish authorities in Qamishli said it has not responded to requests for cooperation. Including Leeds, 4 British men are believed to be held in Kurdish and US-run facilities in Syria. The UK has repeatedly said that it cannot help British citizens in places where there is no consular support, although earlier this year it attempted to extradite 2 surviving British members of the terror cell known as the Beatles from Qamishli to the US after stripping them of their US citizenship. The British government has not said whether Leeds' British citizenship has been revoked. Quote, as all UK consular services are suspended in Syria, anyone who does travel to Syria for whatever reason is putting themselves in considerable danger, end quote, a Foreign Office spokesman said. Unlike other Western countries, Canada government maintains that citizens captured in ISIS territory in Syria and Iraq have the right to return home to face questions or criminal charges. But this is not what's going on. They're not facing criminal charges when they return home. Sure, they get questioned, but then many of them are just going free. This is the way we deal with our ISIS fighter. People who pretty much abandon Canada, people who burn their passport, they're being able to return home. It is absolutely disgusting. It puts every single Canadian here at risk. Because how do we know, if they've gone over to do this, how do we know that they won't come back and commit an attack against us? In fact, this is similar to what the Danforth shooting that people had. A lot of people believed, especially considering ISIS took credit for the attack, many people believe that the shooter was a member of ISIS, and he went out and he committed these attacks, and he was clearly targeting people because he came across one brown guy, and he says he's quoted as saying, "I am not going to shoot you," and then he continues on with his shooting spree. So whenever Justin Trudeau and his government says they care about Canada, remember these stories and remember that they don't care. They do not care about your safety whatsoever. And the final story that I have for you today is the Star, the Toronto Star. So this came out of BrianLilly.com, and it says Star accuses Doug Ford of murder, and it says, well, that didn't take long, as Doug Ford marks the 100-day mark of his time as Premier of Ontario. The Toronto Star has accused Ford of killing the province's working class. I'm not exaggerating saying the official newspaper of the Liberals is accusing Ford of murder. It is right in their column that they approved, and he's really not kidding, because it says right up here, as you can see. Hold on. There we go. It's the social murder and the Doug Ford government. In 1845, Friedrich Engel described the phenomena by which the working class residents in Manchester died prematurely because of their living and working conditions. He did not simply label the occurrence as we usually do today, premature deaths due to unfortunate circumstances, but rather coined the term social murder to make explicit the sources of these premature deaths. Who is Friedrich Engels? Friedrich Engels was the associate of Karl Marx, who helped develop Marxism theory, which went on to be socialism and communism. There really isn't much of a difference between these between these three theories. They're pretty much triangular. You can equate one to the next. So the Star has gotten to the point where they're quoting Marx's dogma in order to make their argument against the Doug Ford government. And down here they give the quote. It says, "When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position they inevitably meet too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence, that is, by the sword or the bullet, when it deprives thousands of necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arms of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues which is the inevitable consequence, known that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised, malicious murder against the one which none can defend itself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than a commission, but murder it remains." So they're going to, like, especially this part right here, where it says, where was it? Well, anyway, they're going on about how you willingly are bringing around the death of thousands of people. Well, this is literally what communism did, only it wasn't thousands, it was millions. Tens of millions of people were murdered under Marxist theory, and they're trying to then use the quote by Friedrich Engels to apply that to Doug Ford. As the article goes on to say, what is the relevance of this analysis for Ontario today? Statistics Canada documents that Canadian men in the lowest 20% of the income distributions are 67% more likely to die in any given year than the wealthiest 20%. For women, the figure is 52% more likely. So that's going to be the case regardless of the situation. Look at Venezuela. Their people are starving and dying, and that's under a socialist government right now. But do you think Maduro is suffering? No. In fact, recently there was a video put out where it showed Maduro smoking elegant cigars and eating the best cut of meat. All this going on when his people are sifting through garbage and killing rats in order to eat for themselves. So this is always going to be a situation when you have access to more resources, you're more likely to live a longer life, live a healthier life. And don't confuse me, I am definitely in the lower tier when it comes to people and their lifestyle. I'm not wealthy whatsoever. I'm definitely considered poor. I would be considered the working class. But I think this is a load of crap. And what do they die of? These men and women, respectively, are 67% and 53% more likely to die from heart disease. That's usually due to bad diets, especially when you have the rise of fast food, such as McDonald's. They're more likely to eat them because it's a lot cheaper to buy that sort of food than it is to actually buy healthy food that they need. So that's one of the reasons. 46% and 30% more likely to die from cancer. Once again, a lot of it has to do with the food. Also, if you're in a lot of people who are in less wealthy, they also tend to they'll smoke more. They'll eat less healthier, which has something to do when it comes to from cancer. 249% and 264% more likely to die from diabetes. Food. A lot of this has to do with the type of food that people eat and have access to. 231% and 211% were more likely to die from respiration disease, and 88% and 83% more likely to die from injury than their wealthy counterparts. Statistics Canada also makes clear that these differences in health outcomes are primarily due to material living circumstances and the association of psychosocial stresses associated with not being as well off as the wealthiest 20% of Canadians. Quote, income influences health more directly through access to material resources such as better quality food and shelter, end quote. Exactly. You just stated what it is. That's something you can't undo, but they're pretty much trying to use the Marxist idea that because you have made yourself rich, because you've done well for yourself, you are killing everybody else because of it. Everyone else's death is on you simply because you did well. But now they're trying to attribute this to Doug Ford. Any reasonable leader would do all they could to improve the financial situation of these at risk for disease and health individuals. Instead, we see Doug Ford canceling a minimum wage increase and reducing social assistance increases. Why do you think that is? He cancels the minimum wage increase, but he's keeping it at $14 an hour, so he's canceling upwards of $15 an hour. So that extra buck that would come into play at the beginning of next year, that was Kathleen Wynne's argument. But the problem with this too is you're actually going to cause more problems for the working class, because as we saw when Kathleen Wynne raised the minimum wage, there were less jobs available for people. And the thing is the people who really don't pay their employees well are the big conglomerate corporations. We're talking Walmart, we're talking McDonald's, the ones who have thousands, if not millions, of chain restaurants out there. They can afford, if you up the minimum wage, they can afford to do this. They're not going to like it, but they can afford it. But a lot of the smaller businesses cannot, and you will destroy those businesses. You destroy all the people who can actually make a decent life out of themselves. You destroy the middle class when you do this. And some of these social assistance increases are unnecessary, and they are in and of themselves socialist things to do, such as one thing they're probably making reference to has to do with the basic income project that was being put out by Kathleen Wynne. But let's not forget, at the same time, we just found out that the Wynne government, they were hiding a $15 billion debt. Trudeau's government was promising moderate deficits and then a balanced budget at the end of the year, and he has just increased our debt astronomically to the point where the books can't be balanced until 2050. These are the policies that they're railing against the Ford government that now they're claiming that are actually beneficial to the people. So they want to keep adding on to the debt until we absolutely can't afford it, and eventually our whole society will collapse. The article goes on to say, we see promising to cancel the Fair Workplace and Better Jobs Act that provides improvement to the workplace life to those who do not enjoy the benefits available to the better well-off. There is little doubt that there is a massive imposition of cutbacks to services that are vital for the 20% identified in the Statistics Canada study. What are the terms used to describe such a public policy agenda? Austerity, neoliberalism, conservative politics. And what are the effects of these policies? I will let the titles of the scholarly works divulge answer. The Body Economics, Why Austerity Kills, Recession, Budget Battles, and the Politics of Life and Death by David Stucker and Sanja Basu. How Politics Makes Us Sick, Neoliberal Epidemics by Ted Schrecker and Clara Bambra, Social Murder and Other Shortcomings of Conservative Economics by Robert Chernomas and Ian Hudson. And make no mistake about it, Doug Ford policies will kill. These policies will not just kill the least well-off, but affect the quality of life of all. Let's not put neutral labels on what Doug Ford is doing. It is more than austerity, cutbacks, and conservative politics. It is social murder. How disgusting is that? How disgusting is that Star article? And then people in the media actually wonder why people can call stuff like fake news. Thanksgiving just passed, and I saw how this was even being pushed in my own family. People in my family were talking about the situation where in Bulgaria, a young journalist was raped and murdered. They ended up trying to equate this to how how Donald Trump treats the media, that he calls them fake news. And they're trying to say that this is the result of why people don't trust the media anymore. Or why, and even they went as far as to say that this is probably why the young girl was raped and murdered, is because it was lashback at the media because of it. But this was not the situation. Now, there has been, over the year, about 3 journalists that have been killed, without a doubt, in Europe. But the problem with that is the fact that all the articles that were putting it out were saying that there is nothing to correlate. There was nothing to correlate this journalist being raped and murdered to have anything to do with her job in the media. In fact, they were saying about how across from the park where she ended up getting found, there was a mental hospital, and it's probably more likely that somebody escaped from the mental hospital and committed an atrocious crime against her. They don't see how, if you don't hold the views of the media, if you don't hold these left-wing biases, they don't see why it would be considered fake news. For me, you just need, how many of these liberals and left-wing progressive types, if everyone was like rebel media, if every single news source out there was like rebel media, how many of them would say that they're telling them the truth, that the media represents them? Many of them would have a problem with it. But because they fall on this side of politics, they don't believe that, they don't actually believe that the news is wrong or that the news has a bias, because they think they're just bringing the truth to you. But when you put out articles such as this, where you accuse Doug Ford of murder, but then at the same time, you don't say shit, like really, you don't say shit about the amount of debt that is being brought on by liberal governments, it's just absolutely ridiculous. And another thing I saw was the handling of the NDP in the Ontario provincial election that ended up happening, where Doug Ford was running. No news articles brought out the fact that Lee Now was running a campaign about him and how Lee Now received money received many foreign money from the United States. In fact, they even received money from the Tides Foundation. That is a George Soros foundation. Nobody talked about that. Nobody really talked about much when it came to how radical the NDP were, about how people like Chandra Pasma was saying jobs are not what people need right now, and how they were even trying to be defensive of the idea that NDP members were self-avowed Marxists and were also putting up quotes by Hitler. So you just see the biases that's in there, and then they wonder why people call them fake news. It's absolutely ridiculous. Well, I want to thank you all for tuning in to the True North Report. I hope you got some benefit out of the stories I brought you today. Please like and comment and subscribe, and I will be back soon with more news that affects you.
Hey.